On a brisk autumn morning in late October, the leaves outside the ivy-clad walls of Sterling University, a bastion of America's academic elite, blaze in hues of amber and crimson. Inside, Professor Leonard Grayson's economic history seminar crackled with a different kind of heat. Grayson, a wiry man in his early 50s with sharp cheekbones and perpetual air of intellectual superiority, was infamous across campus for his razor-tongued assaults on what he called the privileged illusions of the right. Today, clad in a charcoal blazer, crimson scarf, and polished loafers, he prowled the lecture hall like a hawk circling its quarry. His voice, crisp and commanding, sliced through the room's stillness as he launched into his opening salvo. The undeniable nexus between inherited wealth and the steady decline of scholarly integrity, he proclaimed, his tone edged with disdain, is nowhere more apparent than in the enrollment of certain individuals whose lineage trumps their intellectual horsepower. His dark eyes, glinting behind wire-rimmed glasses, settled deliberately on a figure seated in the third row, Barron Trump. The young man, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit with a faint pinstripe, sat with his back straight, a fountain pen moving methodically across a leather-bound notebook. His blonde hair caught the light streaming through the tall windows, and his expression remained as serene as the campus pond outside, undisturbed by Professor's pointed barb. Grayson's lips twitched into a thin, sardonic smile. Take, for instance, he continued, his voice rising with theatrical flourish, those who peddle antiquated ideologies, clinging to notions of God, tradition, and flag-waving fervor, yet somehow find themselves occupying seats in our nation's most hallowed halls of learning. One can't help but wonder how they navigated the admissions gauntlet in the first place. A ripple of nervous glances darted across the room, students shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they traced the invisible line between their professor's glare and Barron's calm silhouette. Grayson's fingers tapped the edge of his podium with growing impatience. In 15 years of teaching, he'd honed a near-perfect technique for unsettling his targets, prodding, needling, breaking them down until they cracked under the weight of his scrutiny. Yet this Trump, sat there like a marble statue, impervious to the venom dripping from every syllable. The professor adjusted his scarf with a flick of his wrist and began to pace between the rows of desks, his steps deliberate, his words calculated. Over the years, I've cultivated a rather acute ability to discern genuine intellectual promise, he said, pausing beside Barron's desk with meaningful tilt of his head, and more tellingly, its glaring absence. Consider critical thinking, a cornerstone of academic pursuit. It's fascinating, isn't it, how some students, particularly those tethered to certain political persuasions, seem to stumble over the rudiments of logical deduction? His voice carried a mocking lilt, daring a reaction. A petite student near the front, her auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, raised a hesitant hand. Professor Grayson, she ventured, her tone cautious, should we be focusing on the economic frameworks outlined in the syllabus, like Keynesian theory or the stagflation debates? Grayson's eyes flashed with a mix of amusement and irritation. Oh, this is entirely relevant, Miss Carter, he retorted, his voice sharpening like a blade. How can we possibly unpack the nuances of fiscal policy when some among us still subscribe to the fairy tales of trickle-down economics? He wheeled back toward Barron, his posture stiffening. Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you genuinely comprehend the sophisticated economic principles we wrestle with in this room, or are you merely parroting the simplistic platitudes you've overheard at your father's gilded dinner table? The lecture hall fell into a thick, expectant silence. Every eye turned to Barron, who lifted his gaze from his notes for the first time, meeting Grayson's stare with a quiet, unshakable confidence. I understand them quite well, Professor, he replied, his voice smooth and measured, carrying the faintest trace of a smile. Would you like to test that comprehension? The words hung in the air, simple yet loaded, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered across Grayson's face, surprise, perhaps, or the tiniest crack in his armor. But he recovered quickly, striding back to the front of the room with a dismissive scoff. A test? He sneered, planting both hands on the podium. I can do you one better than that, Mr. Trump. Let's talk about intelligence. Real, quantifiable intelligence. IQ, to be precise. Did you know that studies consistently reveal a robust correlation between cognitive ability and political leanings? He paused, letting the implications settle, then straightened with a thin, triumphant smile. I, for one, have scored in the uppermost percentile of every intelligence assessment I've ever undertaken. Standardized tests, graduate aptitude exams, you name it. Barron's eyes narrowed slightly, though his tone remained even. That's impressive, Professor, he said, tilting his head. Though I've always found it curious, if someone feels a need to incessantly broadcast their brilliance, how brilliant can they truly be? Grayson's face flushed a deep, angry red, the color creeping up from his neck to his temples. Is that so? He snapped, his fingers tightening around the podium's edges until his knuckles blanched. I find it utterly preposterous that someone who subscribes to fantastical tales of divine creation, or whatever quaint myths you hold dear, would dare to question my intellectual credentials. A few students shifted in their seats, casting sidelong glances at one another, the tension in the room thickening like fog. Barron remained still, his expression a mask of calm resolve. You seem extraordinarily invested in proving your mental supremacy to us, Professor, he said evenly. I'm curious, what exactly are you so desperate to establish? The class collectively held its breath, the air crackling with anticipation. Grayson's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing to slits. Establish, he spat, his voice rising to a near shout. I'll tell you what I'll establish. I'll establish that your very presence in this classroom is an affront to principles of academic excellence. He straightened abruptly, a dangerous gleam sparking in his eyes as a predatory grin spread across his face. In fact, why don't we resolve this with cold, hard science? Mensa administers supervised IQ tests, neutral, empirical, irrefutable. I propose we all take one, the entire class, unless, of course, you're too frightened of what the numbers might reveal. Barron closed his notebook with slow, deliberate motion, resting his pen atop it before looking up with that same faint, unshakable smile. Actually, Professor, I think that's a brilliant suggestion, he said, his tone as steady as ever. But let's make it interesting. If my score surpasses yours, would you be willing to publicly retract your assertions about conservative students being intellectually inferior? A wave of hushed murmurs swept through the room, a student in the back row letting out a low, involuntary whistle. Grayson threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the high ceiling. Oh, this is rich, he crowed, spreading his arms wide as if addressing an unseen audience. You genuinely believe you could outscore me? Let me enlighten you, young man. I've been tested multiple times, and my IQ consistently ranks among the elite tiers of academia. Then you've got nothing to worry about, Barron replied, his voice a calm counterpoint to Grayson's histrionics. Fine, the professor snapped, his smile turning feral. And when you score in the basement percentile, as I fully anticipate, you'll withdraw from my class immediately. I refuse to squander my expertise on a mind too feeble to absorb it. Barron leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking with Grayson's. And when I score higher, he said, emphasizing the when with quiet certainty, you'll concede that intelligence isn't dictated by political affiliation. Do we have a deal? Grayson's grin widened, dripping with condescension. Deal, he said, his tone mocking. And I'll go further. If, by some miraculous fluke, you surpass me, which is about as likely as discovering empirical proof for your religious bedtime stories, I'll admit it to the entire faculty in writing. Barron extended his hand across the desk, his posture relaxed but resolute. Then let's a Mensa oversee it, to keep things official. Grayson strode forward and seized Barron's hand, squeezing with unnecessary force, his eyes alight with anticipation. I'll contact him this afternoon, he said, his voice low and triumphant. I can't wait to dismantle this little masquerade of yours. Barron nodded, withdrawing his hand without a flinch. Just remember, Professor, he added, his words carrying clearly across the now silent room, you're the one who made intelligence the yardstick of worth. Let's hope that choice doesn't turn into your own undoing. Grayson smirked, undeterred, and waved a dismissive hand as he turned back to his notes. Word of the showdown spread across Sterling University like wildfire, igniting debates in dormitories, dining halls, and study lounges. In the days that followed, Grayson swaggered through his lectures with renewed vigor, weaving his economic discourse with sly jabs about cognitive capacity and the supremacy of scientific evidence. As we'll soon demonstrate, he declared to a packed hall on Wednesday, his scarf fluttering as he gestured emphatically. Certain individuals simply lacked the wiring for higher-order reasoning. His smug glances toward Barron's seat grew more frequent, though they seemed to slide off the young man's unflappable composure like water off glass. Students whispered among themselves, placing bets on the outcome, while faculty members raised intrigued eyebrows in the staff lounge. The campus buzzed with a mix of excitement and unease. This was no ordinary academic spat. It was a public crucible. On the morning the results were due, Friday, November 3rd, Grayson arrived early, his briefcase swinging confidently at his side, a Mensa representative trailing behind him in a nondescript gray suit. The lecture hall hummed with restless energy as students filed in, many having opted to take the test themselves out of sheer curiosity or solidarity. The wooden seats creaked under their weight, and the air carried the faint scent of coffee and nervous sweat. Grayson stood at the podium, practically vibrating with anticipation, his scarf draped over one shoulder like a victor's sash. "Before we proceed," he announced, his voice booming with barely contained glee, "I'd like to share some preliminary statistics from our little experiment." He snatched a sheet of paper from his briefcase and held it aloft. The class average was a commendable 125, a strong showing, I must say. However, he paused for dramatic effect, his eyes locking on to Barron with predatory delight. There was one outlier, a dismal 93. A few students snickered, assuming the obvious. "But the number that truly matters," Grayson continued, his voice swelling with pride, "is the highest score, 170. He pulled a sealed envelope from his briefcase, waving it like a trophy, which, I strongly suspect, belongs to yours truly. He tore into his own results with a flourish, his smirk faltering for a split second as he scanned the page. 145, he said, clearing his throat. Not my finest hour, perhaps, but still exceptional, well within the top tier. Barron sat quietly in his usual spot, his own unopened envelope resting on his desk, that same subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Grayson scanned the room, his confidence still intact. Well, then who's next? He called, his gaze lingering pointedly on Barron, who showed no inclination to volunteer. Sarah Mitchell, a junior with reputation as Grayson's most ardent disciple, raised her hand eagerly. Known for her fiery defenses of every progressive stance the professor championed, she opened her envelope with a confident flourish. 110, she announced, her voice shrinking as her smile faded. Grayson blinked, recovering quickly. Well, that's solid, he said, forcing a grin. Jason, your analyses of systemic disparities have always impressed me. Let's hear it. Jason, a lanky senior with a penchant for nodding vigorously during Grayson's rants, unfolded his slip. 128, he said, his tone flat. Grayson's scarf twitched as he tugged at it unconsciously. Alexandra, he pressed, turning to a bespectacled sophomore whose essay on dismantling conservative fiscal myths had earned his praise. Your work's been exemplary. 115, she muttered, avoiding his gaze. A pattern was emerging, and it wasn't the one Grayson had envisioned. His ideological protégés, the student he lauded all semester for their superior intellect, were consistently falling below the class average. This is intriguing, Grayson mumbled, his earlier bravado dimming as he adjusted his glasses. The two most significant scores, 93 and 170, remained unclaimed, and his carefully orchestrated triumph was teetering on the brink of collapse. He straightened his blazer with an irritated jerk and turned to face Barron directly, his voice cutting through the room's growing unease. All right, let's dispense with the theatrics, he said, his tone sharp and brittle. This was always about you and me, wasn't it, Mr. Trump? Let's see what we're dealing with. The silence grew dense, almost tangible, as Barron picked up his envelope with a calm that seemed to amplify the tension. He opened it with deliberate care, his expression unchanging as he reviewed the contents, while Grayson's smirk widened in anticipation of what he was certain would be a devastating humiliation. The Mensa representative cleared his throat, stepping forward. Mr. Trump scored 170. The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of papers as Grayson's face drained of color, his complexion turning a sickly gray. His hands trembled as he snatched the result slip from Barron's grasp, his eyes darting frantically across the text. This is impossible, he sputtered, his voice cracking. There's been an error, a fraud. A student in the back, one of Grayson's most vocal cheerleaders, broke the stillness. Wait, are you saying Barron got the highest score? No, Grayson shouted, whirling around, his scarf slipping to the floor. This is a sham. It has to be. This is precisely the kind of deceit I'd expect from a Trump. Cheating, manipulation, lies. Barron opened his mouth to respond, but Grayson barreled on, his eyes suddenly lighting up at what he thought was a lifeline. Hold on a moment, he exclaimed, slapping the podium with a triumphant thud. I remember now. During the test, you were the only one pulled aside for an additional assessment after finishing the first. Special treatment, was it? Several students nodded, murmuring in agreement, and for a brief second, the room seemed to tilt back toward Grayson's narrative. Anyone else recall that? He demanded, his voice rising with desperate certainty. The representative whisked him away. Explain that, Trump, or did your father grease the wheels for that too? Barron started to speak, but Grayson cut him off, his words tumbling out in a frenzied rush. Just as I suspected, rigged from the start. The Mensa official stepped forward again, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Grayson's unraveling. Professor Grayson, he interjected, his tone measured and firm. Mr. Trump's initial test performance exceeded the upper limits of our standard assessment, which caps at 160. When I scored his first exam on site, the preliminary results were extraordinary, beyond what our baseline test could accurately measure. That's why I administered the advanced evaluation. It's a rare protocol, one I've employed only 3 times in my 15 years with Mensa. A few students couldn't suppress their laughter, the sound sharp and unexpected, hitting Grayson like a physical blow. His expression morphed from righteous fury to dawning horror as the implication sank in, his carefully constructed facade of intellectual dominance crumbling before the class's eyes. This change is nothing, he snarled, gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles gleamed white against the skin. A test score is just a digit. It doesn't negate the fact that your worldview, your values, your entire mode of thought is fundamentally defective. Barron's response was soft but piercing, cutting through the tension like a blade. You're right, Professor. A score is just a number. Isn't it fascinating, though, that you're now dismissing the very metric you chose to define my worth? The same one you were certain mere minutes ago would cement your supremacy. The class shifted uncomfortably, a few students exchanging wide-eyed glances as Grayson's face reddened further, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Don't twist us around, he barked. You and your ilk still cling to archaic superstitions. You reject reason, science, do we? Barron interrupted, his voice gentle yet firm. Or do we simply recognize that wisdom transcends raw intellect? That faith and logic aren't mutually exclusive? That the farmers, factory workers, and small-town entrepreneurs you sneer contribute as much to this nation as any ivory tower academic? Grayson recoiled, his lips curling. Those people are the reason our society stagnates. Those people, Barron cut in, his tone steady but resolute, are my family's employees, the backbone of America. They may not match your 145 on an IQ test, Professor, but they work tirelessly, raise strong families, and live by principles of honor and resilience. I've learned more about true intelligence, about wisdom, compassion, and character from them than any standardized exam could ever gauge. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the classroom, a subtle shift in the air as students began to see Barron in a new light. Grayson's gaze darted around, his usual chorus of supporters now studying their desks or nodding faintly toward a young man in the third row. By the way, Professor, Barron added, his voice softening, your 145 is remarkable. You should take pride in it. I only wish you could feel that pride without needing to diminish others to prop it up. Grayson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. For perhaps the first time in his storied career, the silver-tongued professor found himself utterly speechless. His meticulously crafted ideology, where cognitive prowess and political alignment were one and the same, collapsing under its own weight. Class dismissed, he finally croaked, his voice hoarse as he gathered his papers with trembling hands. We'll revisit this next session. Students began to file out, many offering Barron respectful nods or quiet smiles as they passed. Grayson slumped into his chair behind the podium, staring blankly at the wall, his scarf lying forgotten on the floor. The day's lesson had indeed been about intelligence, just not the kind he'd intended to impart. Later that afternoon, as the last stragglers exited the lecture hall, Barron lingered behind, his suit jacket draped over one arm, a stack of papers in his hand. He approached Grayson's desk, where the professor sat hunched over his notes, his glasses fogged with the strain of the morning. "These are my notes from your lecture so far, Professor," Barron said, sliding the sheaf across the desk. "I've annotated them with some observations from my father's business ventures and our family's interactions with working Americans across the country, farmers in Iowa, machinists in Ohio, shopkeepers in Georgia. I thought you might find them worth a look." Grayson glanced up, his eyes narrowing, then took the papers with a tentative hand, flipping through the neat handwriting and detailed margins. A spark of genuine curiosity flickered in his expression. "You know, Mr. Trump," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, "in all my years behind this podium, I've never had a student turn the tables on me quite like you have today. I've spent decades teaching, dissecting, critiquing, and yet here you are, showing me there's still something to learn, even from those I'd written off." Barron smiled, a small, earnest curve of his lips. "We all have lessons to glean from one another, Professor, even those we're quick to dismiss." He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly in the emptying room, but Grayson called after him, his tone stripped of its earlier venom. "Mr. Trump, thank you. Thank you for showing me that real intelligence isn't just a number on a page. It's a choice, isn't it? A way of seeing the world." Barron paused at the door, glancing back with a nod. "It is, Professor. Always." And with that, he stepped into the hall, leaving Grayson alone with his thoughts, the stack of notes still clutched in his hands. And there it was, the true lesson of that autumn day at Sterling University. In a world so eager to categorize, to judge, to divide along lines of intellect or ideology, the most brilliant minds are often the ones who choose bridges over barriers, understanding over arrogance, respect over ridicule, wisdom over mere knowledge.